Sure. Meg?
Yes.
So a little bit about me. I have been making photographs for over 50 years now. And actually, I came upon Manzanar accidentally back in 1977 after a ski trip to Mammoth Mountain. I saw something off in the distance off of the highway and pulled over and decided to get out of the car and take a look at what was there. Growing up in Southern California, I had no idea that this place existed. It wasn't taught in schools. I went to school with Japanese American kids. It was never spoken about. And so to come across this place was quite a surprise. And of course, I had to do a lot of research after I got there for the first time and captured my first images. And as I started learning about this place, it just kept drawing me back. And over the years, there was a gap of time which I didn't go. That was when I was starting a business and raising a family and doing all those sorts of things. But over a 40-year span, it kept drawing me back, and I kept capturing images, and got to a point where I wanted to do something with these. This poster here was the actual poster that was hung around Bay Bridge Island, letting the Japanese community know they were being evacuated or taken out of their homes within days. And I wonder what any of us would think if we saw something like that nailed to a telephone pole in our community, and if it said something other than Japanese. So I just wanted to show that because I think that is quite shocking to see that. Are you there, Meg?
I am. Yep.
Okay.
Just it wasn't advancing, so I'm trying.
That's weird.
There we go.
Okay. So Manzanar is in a place called Owens Valley, which is on the eastern side of the Sierra Nevada mountains. It's a very desolate place. It's a beautiful place. The area is beautiful. The eastern Sierra Nevada are beautiful. This is a view of the Inyo Mountains on the eastern side of Owens Valley. This also is looking that same direction. And this is looking towards the eastern side of the Sierra Nevada. And it's quite desolate there and in the middle of nowhere. This was one of the first images I shot in 1977. This is what I believe I saw from the highway. And these first few images are from 1977. They were shot on film. There was no digital back then. But these are the shots that made me wonder what the heck went on here. There's just steps like this going to nowhere. And that's what I started researching. Of course, there are no people in these images. And I've been asked about that. And of course, nobody lives there. Nobody's there any longer, except the park rangers. It's now a National Historic Site. But it's what's left that really grabbed my attention and was quite moving for me. And so those were the images that I captured. I also tried not to capture specific things that have been, I'll say, reproduced, although there are a number of images like this one here and the next two. As the Park Service has taken over the grounds, they're trying to recreate things that are, were kind of there. The barracks, there's a replica latrine building. Actually, there's a mess hall that was actually brought back about believe 45 miles north, that was at the Bishop Airport. And they're trying to recreate these things to give people the feel of what living at the camp for 3.5 years might have been like. But what's left is a lot of broken up concrete and pathways that lead to nowhere. As you can see, these are foundation pads for one of the mess halls that used to be there. A lot of this over the years had been covered up by windstorm, sand, and mud flows. The camp was basically dismantled and sold off after the war. And this is basically all that has remained. And since the National Park Service took the site over, they've done some digging and uncovered certain areas to give a better idea of what was there. So it's a lot of, like I said, broken up concrete foundations, pathways and steps that lead to nowhere. I thought these were quite telling. These were impressions left by toilets in one of the latrines, and they looked like faces to me. I had a friend of mine look at the prototype to the book, and he came to me after he was looking through it and said, "I'm really not sure what to say." And I said, "Well, what do you mean?" And he said, "Well, I'm having a hard time with these images because they're beautiful images, but they're images of such a tragic time in our history, and I'm just not sure how to rectify that." And I wasn't quite sure what to say because I never quite looked at it that way. I knew what I was photographing over a period of time, but I'm a photographer, and I was trained to see things a certain way and photograph things a certain way. And so there is a certain inherent beauty, I think, in what I photographed, especially in the location. But these images do tell a story also. And that was really important to me. As I learned more about this place and what took place after World War II with the other 9 camps, it made me think of my heritage. I'm of Jewish background, and knowing what took place in Europe at the same time. Of course, these weren't death camps, but nonetheless, these were camps, concentration camps, that 120,000 people, 2/3 of whom were US citizens, were taken from their homes, their schools, their businesses, their communities, and put behind barbed wire, being watched by armed guards for 3.5 years. And they never had their day in court. They were just told to vacate, and that's not good. Are we still there? I hope, yeah. They were told to vacate, get on buses and trains, and were taken to these camps. And most of them lost everything that they owned. There were a few situations where they had neighbors that didn't agree with what was taking place, and the neighbor watched over their property or took care of their belongings, and they had something to come back to after the war. But a majority of them came back to nothing and had to start their lives from scratch. If you ever get a chance to be in this part of the country, first of all, the drive on Highway 395, it is a beautiful drive, and there's lots to see, but I do highly recommend stopping at Manzanar. It's quite moving, and I have no doubt that it will be a memorable experience for you if you stop there. And of course, life wasn't put on hold for those 3.5 years, just like what we're going through now. There were people that died and never went back to their homes after the camp. There are still, I believe, 6 people buried at Manzanar. The rest of them were reinterred elsewhere after the war. This is an interesting plaque. It was commemorating the 100th and the full 42nd regiments, which were Japanese Americans during World War II, while their families were being held in concentration camps. And that does that.
I'm not seeing any questions coming up here yet, Brian. So
okay,
we'll just continue with the presentations. And Clarence, I think you have a lot to tell to fill in some of the details of the story that Brian is referring to. So take it away.
You bet. And thanks again for hosting this and the opportunity to share this story and your beautiful photographs, Brian. They're really, really wonderful and lovely. I want to share a little bit, set up the situation. The Bainbridge Island Japanese, most of them came in the 1880s because of a recession, and they worked at the world's largest lumber mill at the time. It was the Port Blakely Mill, and also the Hall Brothers Shipyard, and people from all around the world worked there: Croatians, Swedes, Norwegians, Chinese, Japanese, of course, Filipinos. And this created a tight-knit community from the start because everybody worked at these industries, that and compulsory public education. And I'm sharing that with you because it made the Bainbridge Island story, I believe that's why it's different. So after the mill went down, they started Strawberry Farm, you had other businesses. And then of course, December 7th happened. That's when the Imperial forces of Japan bombed Pearl Harbor and Hawaii. And on that day and the next day, in 48 hours, the FBI not only went to Pearl Harbor, but they went to 23 other cities throughout the United States, and in less than 2 days rounded up 1,391 elders of the community. On February 4th, they came to Bainbridge Island with the assistance of the Kitsap County Sheriffs and the Washington State Patrol, and they hit all 50 Japanese American homes simultaneously and took away about 30 of our elders. And it raided probably every Japanese American home up and down the West Coast from Canada down to the Arizona border. And they were able to do this because the FBI since the mid-1930s had been surveilling everybody of 1/16th Japanese ancestry. And every time a new baby was born, they created a brand new file. So they had all this actionable data. And keep in mind, back in 1942, Bainbridge Island was not like today. It was an incredibly rural area with a lot of roads that did not have names. They didn't have names, but yet the FBI knew exactly where they wanted to go. We suspect there were people on the island that shared that. Also, it was not discovered until 2007 that the Census Bureau shared that information with the FBI too, which is illegal. So on February 19th, our president, President Franklin Delano Roosevelt, signed Executive Order 9066, which set all of this into motion. And about a month later, on March 23rd, Civilian Exclusion Order number 1 was posted throughout the island by soldiers from New Jersey. It gave, as Brian mentioned, only 6 days notice to take what they could carry or wear, and that was it. I brought up this tight family thing because most of the people on Bainbridge Island who had farms and owned farms found someone on the island who would look after their property, pay the taxes and all the rest. I'll cut to the chase. 276 people on Bainbridge Island, more than 150 came back. There isn't a community from the north or south that had maybe 15% return. In places like Bellingham, they passed official resolutions saying you are forbidden to return. So Bainbridge was very different. We also have a lot of credit to the Bainbridge Island Review, or it was called the Bainbridge Review at the time, Walt and Millie Woodward. They had just bought the paper in 41. They editorialized against the Roosevelt's executive action and always wanted to support their friends and families on Bainbridge. And they also had people write back from the camps. And built with that editorial courage, he had death threats. He lost subscribers and advertisers. But he said, no, I'm going to believe this is the Constitution. You're violating it. He's the only newspaper in the course of the war that held that editorial stance and published stories from people behind barbed wire. I think all of those elements together made that so welcoming for Bainbridge to come back to. So on March 30th, the ferry arrived at the Eagle Dell Ferry Dock. That is where the memorial was built on Bainbridge Island. They went to Seattle, got on a train. They went 3 days and 2 nights with the blinds closed. They showed up at Owens Valley, as Brian talked about. And then they were the first people in Manzanar. They showed up there on April 1st, April Fool's Day, 1942. Most of the barracks were still under construction. And after about a year, they petitioned to move to the Minidoka concentration camp in southern Idaho for a couple of reasons. One, they thought it was like Idaho, Northwest would be nice weather. That's where all the people from Seattle went, so they also had friends and family. But most importantly, they did not get along well with the Los Angeles urban Japanese Americans who came to Manzanar and occupied. They were the 10,000 folks who were there. They were the country mice and from Bainbridge, and they were the city mice. Walt Woodward pointed out, because of all the strife and all of the negative influences that those people from Los Angeles were doing, and once they petitioned to go to Minidoka, he said it's very well known that you never can mix Washington apples with California lemons. So they were there, and they got to Minidoka, and they were placed in Block 44, which was the last block, and in one of the last barracks. So Bainbridge Island is literally the figurative and literal bookends of the incarceration story. The first ones to live in a concentration camp and placed in one of the last blocks in one of the last camps. And then they returned, as I mentioned, to a very welcoming community. And so we celebrate that on Bainbridge Island, and you will see that at the memorial. Talking about pictures, Brian had, on that day, the Seattle Post-Intelligencer newspaper came with several photographers and reporters, and they documented the removal very comprehensively. You can see a lot of historical pictures. Most of the pictures that people use nowadays, almost always it's a Bainbridge Island picture involved in that. So that's what the site's about. It's called Nidoto Nayoni, or Let It Not Happen Again. We wanted this site to be a place of honor, a place of healing, and a place of hope. And we did not want blame or guilt or shame. Those feelings are strong. And there's 120,000 stories out there. There isn't one story. To say that would be doing the same guilt as making everybody a collective and all the Japanese are the same. So everybody has a different reaction to how they handle this story. But we wanted to make sure that it was inspired that you would not let it happen again. And I would contend, and in my Humanities Washington presentation, I make the parallels between what happened after Pearl Harbor and what happened after September 11th. I use the propaganda pictures and the propaganda posters from our government, and they are total parallels. You know, Japs go home graffiti, Muslims go home, Jap hunting licenses, Muslim hunting licenses. The fear was palpable. Then I'll close with how I close with the presentation. A former leader of our community, Dr. Frank Kitamoto, he was 2.5 years old when he was incarcerated with the other Bainbridge Islanders and the other 120,000 people. He was our president of the Japanese American community for well over a quarter century. And at one of his last speeches at the Minidoka pilgrimage in 2008, his final line of his keynote address was, "The opposite of love is not hate, it is fear." And I think he's correct. I think we live in fearful times. Things are repeating themselves. Unfortunately, our motto is not living up to itself. We still have family separations. They took away parents at that time. We have, I think it was 666 children. We still don't have any idea where their parents are. Attacks against religion. I'm sure that's going to be talked about later. With Duncan, the prejudice against Muslims, the fears that are moving it. People want to have someone to blame. And I would contend to you that on September 10th, 2001, if you ask someone, what's Muslim or what's Islam, you get a pretty blank stare. Maybe Muhammad Ali or Kareem Abdul-Jabbar might come up. But on September 11th, suddenly everybody, not everybody, but this country had Islamophobia and a lot of attacks toward Middle Eastern and Arab people. We spin on it that fast in a time of fear. What our site is trying to do is show the spirit of what Bainbridge Islanders did. They had their friends and neighbors back. They went against the incredible tide of prejudice and fear and said, these are our friends and neighbors, these are people, and this is against the Constitution. They had the backing of the editorial support of their newspaper. It made it this incredibly safe place, of which really is what America should have been. And so it's wonderful that the site's there. We hope you come and visit, and we hope you leave with the inspiration of our motto, Nidoto Nayoni, let it not happen again.
I think it's, just to pick up on that, I think it's quite remarkable how prominent Japanese Americans came forward right after the September 11th attacks and the attacks on Muslims and Trump's more recent attacks on Muslims, they've been out front, people like George Takei, on, opposing this because what happened. I want to point to a couple of literary texts. Thank you so much for that, Clarence. I learned a lot that I didn't know. A couple of texts. We actually have one of our prominent local artists and citizens, Terry Nomura. Her father, Carl Nomura, wrote a book. It's called Sleeping on Potatoes, about his experience at Manzanar, which I would encourage you to talk about. Yeah. And in our chat, I've just learned that a local poet named Mike Dillon, Holly Hughes tells us this, recently wrote a powerful collection about this called Departures, Poetry and Prose on the Removal of Bainbridge Island's Japanese after Pearl Harbor. I do have a couple of questions for you, Clarence. One was from Bill Wise. He says, is it possible that this could happen again to a class of American citizens?
I would say yes. I would say, look at what's happening with the inspiration of Stephen Miller and his white supremacist ilk in the White House, how they just rounded up people at the border indiscriminately. They're just seeking political asylum. If they had the opportunity to do that, they would. And I would also suggest that the places that they stored those children look just like concentration camps. They were just higher tech and they were air-filled and had air conditioning, but they're still concentration camps. And I got to come back to the children, how in our name, these children are on concrete behind cages. It's just incredibly heartbreaking. So I would say, yes, it can happen again, at least to certain people and a certain group, maybe not a mass group, but a million is a statistic, one is a tragedy. So you cannot diminish, maybe it's only 666 children, but that's immense. And these are going to be lifelong scars for those children, as well as all these other people who just were seeking safety. So yeah, we fell into fear pretty fast. And that was manufactured fear, by the way, by this administration. So, which is very similar to what happened in World War II. I have to make one point. There's one person on listening on here. There's a very famous picture of a woman. Her name is Fumiko Hayashida. She's holding a baby. She's looking off in the distance and the baby's in her arms and got a tag on both of them. And that daughter's name was Natalie Hayashida. She was 13 months old and she's listening in on us right now. She's one of the listeners, Natalie Hayashida Ong, and she lives in Texas now. So just want to make a big shout out to Natalie and thank you for listening and being a part of living history.
Thanks, Natalie. Can I add one thing to that, Kerry, real quick? Because I have had a bit of pushback comparing this to some of the things that are taking place today. And Shira, my wife, and I, who she helped me with a lot of the text, she was a co-author in the book, we do compare this to things that are happening today. And basically what I kind of finally realized was this is purely how humans treat humans. And whether they're citizens or not should be irrelevant because we haven't learned these lessons yet, it seems. We continue to stoke fear and continue to do these types of things. And it's one of the reasons I finally wanted to show this work, was hopefully it was going to instill some thought in people to help us move forward. Enough already. So
it's a pretty radical thing Brian did that some of you'll see when he goes to Northwind, where he substitutes other groups, Caucasians and others, for the big Japanese in the executive order poster of fame. I have a question from Corey Shiozaki for you, Clarence, about the connection between snowfalls on Cedar and the people experience at Bainbridge Island.
Yeah, it's a very famous novel. It's written by a high school teacher here on the island, David Guterson. And it's a fictionalized account of what happened on Bainbridge Island. It's called San Pedro Island. There was a murder involved, so there wasn't really any of that To Kill a Mockingbird drama on Bainbridge Island. But he does, I think, accurately depict the removal, the prejudice that took place. He also has a person named, I believe it was Mr. Chambers, who was the fictional character of Walt Woodward, the newspaper publisher. So it was really his model. There was a strawberry festival. So he was inspired to do this here, inspired to do it by the Bainbridge Island story. And then when the movie was made, many of Bainbridge Islanders went to be extras on the ferry removal scene, which was filmed right there in Port Townsend at the older ferry dock there. They had to get up at 4 o'clock in the morning and do this scene over and over and over. But many of them have talked about it and said, you know, they were kind of relieved and they got onto the ferry. But once the ferry left, everybody got quiet because they looked back and, you know, it was just the ferry leaving and they're wearing, you know, period costumes for this movie. But Lily Kitamoto, she said, my heart just sank because I was envisioning that, well, what if this was like what my mother was feeling? And she knew the ferry was going to come back, but she said her mother didn't know if the ferry would ever come back. Her mother didn't know she would ever come back to her home. And so that was a magical moment for a lot of the people who were in that film and telling that story. So Snow Falling on Cedars did an awful lot to promote and expand this story to a much broader audience.
I've got a question from Linda Hortz. And I think this will have to be our last question before we move on. Were the Japanese Americans able to return directly to their homes in the US if they chose after the war ended, or were they forced to go someplace else, as I believe they had to in Canada?
Well, Canada was far worse, but that's a whole nother description. As I described, Bainbridge Island was different. Bainbridge Island they wanted their friends to come back. The Curras sold it to their farm to the Rabers for $1, and then when they came back, they used the same dollar to get the farm back. As I mentioned in my presentation, maybe I spoke very quickly, but no place, not even Seattle, had more than 15% return. There was that much hatred, and no one would be willing to look after their properties. A lot of the Nihon Machi, or the Japanese town that's in the international district, many of those businesses, they were one of Lily Kitamoto's father was a jeweler and had a store in town and in that area. And they lost those businesses. They're long gone. So that's a tragic part. And so where they went, they had to find other opportunities. And that's why there are Japanese communities in places like Roar, Arkansas and Colorado, because they left the camps, but they had to go somewhere. And so they settled in relative proximity to wherever they were incarcerated. So that explains why there's sometimes pretty vibrant communities in places you would never expect them to be.
And some of them, as I learned from Duncan's book, also took their Buddhism with them across the country and helped popularize Buddhism in places like Chicago, where it had not really been before. Duncan, one of the things I took most from Duncan's book and working on it's full of fabulous stories, including a lot about the Japanese Americans who were patriotic and volunteered and fought bravely in Europe in World War II. It's a whole chapter devoted to an amazing guy who became a spy for General MacArthur in the Eastern Theater. But I think one of the biggest things I took away from the book certainly was about how much the struggle in the camps and elsewhere with Japanese Americans, including in the Army, had to do with trying to preserve and extend their and draw upon their Buddhist faith at a time when most Japanese Americans were Buddhists, at a time that Buddhism itself was thought to be unpatriotic, and how this contributed to the struggle over freedom of religion in the United States and an extension of its meaning. So, Duncan, can you tell us a little bit about that?
Sure. Thank you very much, Kerry, for inviting me to this event, and my appreciations to Clarence and Brian for their presentations, and congratulations, of course, to Brian Goodman for the book. I don't know, Meg, if you can share the images that I hope to speak about. But as Kerry mentioned previously, I actually don't have a family connection to this history because I was, born and raised in Japan. But my professor, who was my mentor during the time I was doing my PhD at Harvard, his father was Reverend Shinjo Nagatomi, who you see in this photograph standing in front of the monument that Brian has in his book. There's a whole section in Brian Goodman's book about page 148 onwards about the cemetery area, about the monument there and what people left. And this is him in 1943 in front of that monument. And that dedication of this monument is something I thought maybe I could focus in on today. Just because that's my main connection to Manzanar, as I translated the diary of this Buddhist priest, who was one of the few Buddhist priests in the WRA camps. Most of them were taken to Army and Department of Justice camps, and usually rounded up right after Pearl Harbor. In fact, one of the most surprising pieces of information I came across in my research at the National Archives was that the very first person picked up on the day of the Pearl Harbor attack at 3 p.m. that day, even before the smoke had cleared, and even before the 3:30 declaration of martial law, was Reverend Gikyo Kuchiba, who was a very good friend of Reverend Nagatomi in this photograph. He was serving at the same denomination's temple in Honolulu. And the second person they picked up was also another Buddhist priest that belongs to my sect of Buddhism. I'm also ordained as a Buddhist priest. And so I was always fascinated why, when the outbreak of war happened, were the first people that the intelligence agencies, the Army, G2, the Office of Naval Intelligence, and the FBI, why did they hone in on Buddhist priests? And so that's what I kind of take up in my book as to is how not only race, but religion mattered in how the Japanese American community was treated by the government at that time. But in terms of this monument itself, it was, if I could go to the next slide, it was built, conceived of by Reverend Nagatomi, and thought about in terms of a kind of Buddhist tower. We call it gorinto, or a 5-tiered tower. And in the middle there is a drawing found in the Nagatomi collection at the Manzanar Historical Site. But it was actually a kind of interfaith effort to build a monument of remembrance. And I think this is one of the kind of major themes of Brian Goodman's book, Footsteps Remain, that there are kind of various kinds of ideas about remembrance and memory, and that this monument was in fact a form of remembrance and memory during the war itself. Located in the cemetery area of the camp, Reverend Nagatomi hoped to build this kind of memorial or monument to kind of console the spirits of those, especially those who had died in that first spring and winter, spring, into the early summer of 1943. And this monument was something that he went around with many other people too, going barrack to barrack, asking for each family to donate between 5 cents or 10 cents per family to buy the concrete necessary to build it. I say it was an interfaith monument because the architect who actually designed the final version of the monument was a Catholic, Japanese Catholic architect who had built some Catholic structures in Southern California, Ryozo Kado. And then when it came time to actually build it, it was the Young Buddhist Association, or the YBA group from Los Angeles, and the residents of Block 9 who actually put the concrete structure together. And then Reverend Nagatomi, the Buddhist priest, he had been practicing those 3 kanji characters, I, Re, To, the consoling, the spirits, and tower, many times before he finally completed it on the monument itself. And on the day of the dedication in August of 1943, he invited Reverend Jundo Kashitani of the Holiness Church, a Christian minister, to come and kind of co-dedicate it. So it was a kind of interfaith effort at that time. It represented the idea of not leaving anybody out, or kind of not forgetting anybody. You know, especially those who were vulnerable, frail, and couldn't survive for that first year. If I could go to the next slide, please. So these kind of ireto or irehi, these monuments, were also built in other camps. The same name is used for the one that was built in Amache or Grenada in Colorado, ireto, and then over in Rower in Arkansas, it was called irehi. And it just means a monument as opposed to a tower. But the one in Arkansas, also built at the cemetery there, was designed by Reverend Daisetsu Hayashima, a Buddhist priest, who made sure that in that particular version of the kind of monument, they had this kind of lotus flowers at the bottom, and you can kind of see the leaves of the lotus there. And that's a very traditional Japanese sculptural technique to indicate that it's a Buddhist monument. And if I could go to the next slide, please. And as I mentioned, much of this was based on the idea that faith was something that people turned to at a time when they had gone to these places for a time indefinite, losing their businesses, disrupting their college education, so many different losses. I think faith for Christians, as well as for Buddhists and others, was something that people might turn to try to get some kind of orientation, meaning and purpose at this very difficult time. And of course, that was only compounded when somebody in the family passed away in camp. And I think just for Manzanar, I believe there's almost 150 people who passed away during the war period. And as Brian mentioned, of course, most people were later interned somewhere else, but there were maybe 5-6 people that remained at Manzanar in the cemetery. If I could go to the final slide, please. So just because of limited time, I kind of wanted to wrap up by talking about how the very next day after the dedication of that monument, over 4,500 people turned up for the annual Obon ceremony. If you can read the Japanese on here, it says Manzana Bukkyokai Bon-odori, and it says 1943, August the 15th. So the dedication of the monument happened the day before, and then now they were in the Obon season, which is a kind of season that Buddhists believe that the spirits of the ancestors, those who've gone before, those who passed away, especially in the previous year, it's called Nibon, those who passed away more recently, are to be welcomed through a kind of festival of dance and kind of a celebratory thing. So I mentioned the fact that Buddhist priests were the first targeted and arrested, but all throughout the World War II experiences, many indications that Buddhism was seen as un-American, if not anti-American. So for example, when people first went into the so-called assembly centers, anything written in Japanese, like a Buddhist sutra, any book that had Japanese language in it, even like a book of poetry, was considered contraband, like cameras and guns and so forth, and they were confiscated in almost all circumstances. There were two exceptions to what could be brought in with Japanese language in it. One was a English-Japanese dictionary, and the other was a Christian Bible. If that was in Japanese, that was permissible. So the message most people got as they went into camp was that if you're English-speaking and Christian, that is a more acceptable way of belonging in America. And so in the end, as Buddhists began to get used to life in camp and turn to their faith, began to gather again, one of the things behind the scenes that was happening was that in 1943, there was something called the loyalty questionnaire. And most people who know about this subject know very well question 27 and 28, these questions that if you answered them the wrong way, no and no, you were segregated and put in a different camp. It had to do with this kind of test of loyalty. But fewer people know about question number 16, which is about religion. And if you answered that question on religion as a Japanese American, you put Christian, you got plus 2 points. If you answered Shinto, you were got a automatic kind of denial of the possibility of ever leaving camp. And if you answered Buddhist, you got -1 point. In other words, during the war, even though the United States, constitutionally has this line about religious freedom as very first part of the Bill of Rights and the most important part of the First Amendment, the actual way in which it worked was that most Japanese Americans were Buddhists at that time, but being told that if you convert to Christianity or if you somehow assert something else other than Shinto or Buddhism, that's going to be a much more favorable future for you in America. So that's why I ended with this photo. In this camp, which at its peak, obviously it's like 10,000 people or so, almost half the camp turned out to dance that night, unafraid of whatever consequences that might be viewed by the authorities as a kind of public display of people exercising their free practice of religion. And so let me just end with that as the kind of like hopeful kind of practice that they had, where what remains, as Brian Goodman's book suggests, what are the things that remain? That monument, the Ireto, still remains at the cemetery site at Manzanar. And to me, that's a very important symbol of not only faith groups coming together and being an interfaith effort during the war to honor those who've passed away, but also it's making sure that a symbol remained for us today, to note that there were people, despite the fact that their freedoms had been taken away, who were asserting, at least in this case, religious freedom, even behind barbed wire and armed guards. So let me end there, and I'm happy to take any questions.
That struggle to practice their religion, you've argued, is actually a kind of expansion of the whole concept of the American freedom of religion, given that it was always kind of assumed, I think, that we were talking about first Protestantism and then Catholicism sort of got added in there, but they were all Abrahamic religions, basically. One of the other struggles that you mentioned in the book that I think is noteworthy, the struggle of the troops in Europe who took some of the heaviest losses, some of the heaviest casualties, and were involved in some of the most consequential battles in the invasion of Europe. The Japanese American troops didn't have a Buddhist chaplain. There were Jewish chaplains and Christian chaplains of various sorts, but not Buddhist. And I know that was a struggle. I don't think they won it, did they, at the time?
That's right. So both in the European theater with the 100th Battalion and later the 442nd Regimental Combat Team, and then in the Pacific Theater with the Military Intelligence Service. The vast majority of those who served, both from those who were either volunteering or drafted out of the camps, or those who came out of the free zones or from the Hawaiian Islands, were Buddhist. But I think people at that time had difficulty seeing Buddhism as a acceptable religion in American life. I remember one story of somebody who was a Buddhist who was, in the induction trying to get the dog tag with the letter B for Buddhist, and was told, son, we don't have Buddhists in the US Army. And he was told to pick between H for Hebrew, C for Catholic, P for Protestant. And he didn't know what, he wanted to get a B on there for Buddhist, but he ended up saying he wanted a P. And when asked why, he said, because I protest. And that was he got assigned to latrine duty after that. But anyway, the idea that the sacrifices of those who served at that time led in the immediate post-war era. I think the 100th Battalion was, even in the media dubbed as the Purple Heart Battalion. There's so many, Saving of the Texas Lost Battalion. There's so many instances of recognition that these men did something that needed to be recognized. And so B was formally added a few years after the war as a possible category for new inductees into the US Army. And then in the National Cemetery, for example, at Punch Bowl in Hawaii, you find instead of the normal practice up until then, which was that if you were Japanese American and Buddhist, you would always get a cross for your tombstone. They added something called a Dharma wheel, which is a Buddhist symbol. So those are the type of it didn't happen during the war, but because of the service of those men, there was some changes in the U.S. military. It's the same military that viewed Buddhism as a threat to national security a few years earlier had shifted by the end of the 1940s.
I have a question for Duncan.
Yeah, sure.
Well, first, I thought when you said he picked a P instead of the B, that he thought the P was just an incomplete B. Would you tell, Duncan, how the placement of the cemetery, why it was chosen at Manzanar and how it got there? Because it's outside the fence.
Right. So I don't know the details on exactly how the location ultimately got chosen. So I'm sorry, I don't know if I can directly answer that question. But certainly they had to, it is a Japanese custom not to have, whether it's burial or cremation remains too close to residential, areas. They have a tradition called kegare, which means a kind of like potentially like kind of like not pollution, but like there's a kind of taint of something that needs to be avoided surrounding death and bones. And so I think it's not surprising that there was some, it wasn't proximate to, but distant from the residential barracks because of that kind of philosophy to separate that. And of course, part of the Japanese traditional way of ritualizing is to take these kind of, somebody, I think Kerry mentioned ghosts at the very beginning, like take those who've recently passed, help to console them. That's why it's called ireto, the consoling of the spirits. Like try to find methods through ritual, through memorial services. And you have these kind of first day, 7th day, 49th day when the spirit is supposed to leave the earth. And you do these different, and obon is another kind of thing. You do these ceremonies so that over time, any kind of negative energy attached to it can be released. and you come into a good relationship with those who've passed. And so, but until then, there's always some idea that some distance need to be maintained. And I think that could be one reason why it was located there.
I
have a question real quick.
I wanted to point out that in addition to people struggling to practice their faith in the camps, there were also a number of people who struggled to practice art in the camps. One of the ones I'm most familiar with is Chair Obata, who was at Hanford, and he had taught at the University of California, Berkeley. They tried to, Sproul himself tried to protect him from going to the camps, was unsuccessful, but he started an art school when he was there. And Brian, I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit about what you know about the Japanese American photographer who was actually in the camps.
Sure, absolutely. His name was Toyo Miyatake. He was a commercial photographer in Los Angeles. And when he was told that they would be evacuated, he decided to kind of break the rules and smuggled a lens and a film holder. At that time, a lot of photographers were using cameras that used sheets of film instead of rolls of film. And he smuggled a film holder into the camp. He had a friend of his who worked in the wood shop build a box, a camera, to put the lens and the film holder on. And then he had a friend from outside the camp that would bring supplies to the camp. And can't remember which company the person worked for, but one of the things that this company sold was film. And so anytime he came to the camp, he would bring film with him and leave it in his jacket pocket and hang his jacket on a coat hanger where Toyo was able to get to it and take the film, very secretively take pictures around camp, and then put the film back in a jacket pocket for his friend to pick up and have processed after he left the camp. At some point, they caught on to what Toyo was doing, and the director of the camp at the time, Ralph Merritt, who was somewhat sympathetic, decided to allow Toyo to continue to capture images, except for one thing. He was allowed to set up his camera and set up his subject matter, but one of Ralph Merritt's employees needed to click the shutter and actually take the photograph. That lasted for a little while, and then eventually Ralph Merritt went to Toyo and said, "Go ahead, take pictures." So there are a number of photographs that Toyo Miyatake has taken that are pretty amazing. There's one in particular that is of three little boys at the barbed wire fence that was actually taken with them outside the fence. And many years later, the photographic business, Toyo went back to commercial photography. He passed it on to his son, Archie, who happened to be at camp. And now his grandson, Alan, owns the family studio. And a number of years ago, Alan found out that those three boys were still alive and happened to be at Manzanar and met them there for a photograph of the three of them outside the fence again. So
what an incredible story.
Yeah.
Do you know why Merritt asked Adams in?
From what I understand, Ansel was a friend of Ralph Merritt's. And like I said, Merritt was somewhat sympathetic to what was happening to the Japanese. He wasn't fully on board with what was taking place, and asked Ansel to come in and photograph camp. Ansel was given very strict instructions, though, as to what he could photograph. And so most of Ansel's photographs are of smiley, happy faces.
I have a question in chat from Corey Shiozaki. I think this is best directed to you, Clarence. She's asking about a newspaper publisher named Mr. Chambers, and if he had a role in assisting in getting Bainbridge Islanders relocated to Minidoka, I think she says. I have a family that relocated there. Do you know anything about that?
Well, she might be confused with the Snow Falling on Cedars character. There was a Chambers who was portraying the Woodwards, Walt and Millie Woodward of the Bainbridge Review, who I mentioned they were strongly in supportive of the Japanese American community. And they, knew what was going on because there was always someone writing back from the camps about, well, some of the gossip, just who broke a leg or, who might have gotten married, but also, what the conditions were. And they knew early on that they were not getting along with all of the Los Angeles urban Japanese who were wearing zoot suits. And as Kei Sakai Nakao mentioned, they were Bainbridge Islanders don't get any sun. And these guys are also dark brown, and she'd never seen Japanese look like that. So it was a big cultural change for the Bainbridge Islanders. And of course, some of them were kind of bullies and strutted around and, picked on them. So that's why a lot of the people from Bainbridge Island petitioned to be with their friends and some of their families in Minidoka in southern Idaho. The Woodwards were reporting on it. And there was a petition, and he published that they were trying to petition it. Now, whether that helped in the final move, I really can't say. I kind of doubt it because I don't think the War Relocation Authority people were looking at the Bainbridge Review that much. But certainly his support kept that island community feel and welcomed all those folks home.
I have a question here from Julie Coriel, and I think it's for you, Duncan, and I'm not sure what it is, but I'll do my best to translate. She says she's puzzled by the translation of Buddhist temples as a church. I think she means as a legal, as a legal phenomenon, that maybe this had something to do with church enabling assimilation and better tax status or something. Do you know anything about that?
Sure. So the largest of the Buddhist kind of denominational organizations, the Jodo Shinshu Nishonganji tradition, used to have as their legal organized name the Buddhist Mission of North America, BMNA. And in 1944, in Topaz, one of the other camps, they had a large kind of like conference, as it were, of representatives from all of the different camps that came together and decided and voted to change their legal name to the Buddhist Churches of America, or BCA, which is what that organization's name still remains to this day. And so the use of the word church, there's a few instances before the war as Julie asked that question, noted it was a form of trying to assimilate and sometimes architecturally, instead of Japanese style architecture, they would put in pews and try to make it look like a Protestant church, and including the use of hymnals and organ music to have kind of like, they call it Sambutsuka, or Buddhist hymns, accompanied by Western music. That was something they didn't really have in Japan, but they did that to kind of make a Sunday worship service look as close to what a Protestant service might look like. So those were things that were happening before the war, but certainly during the war, all of that pressure to assimilate got crystallized. And so you find many temples starting to call themselves churches. And then only in recent decades has some of that stuff from World War II reverted, and some so-called churches have kind of re-registered their names as, something temple instead of church.
I have a couple of more call outs of other texts that people are interested in. One is a recording of two Japanese American poets, Sharon Hashimoto and Lawrence Matsuda, who wrote about their own family experiences, and it's part of the Northwind reading series posted on the Northwind website. Another is, I don't think in a published form, but David Sproul tells us about a George Pipkin who delivered groceries and newspapers and other necessities to people in the camp, and had stories that he told about those. I don't know if either of you, if any of you heard of him, this guy, George Pipkin. Okay.
No, but I'm really familiar with Larry Matsuda, you know, the poet. He's really quite wonderful. Very passionate man too. It's worth looking out for his work.
And I have one more question from Julie. She's asking about whether, she's talking about a book by David Nywert called Strawberry Days, and whether or not the Oriental Exclusion Act of 1924 had anything to do with the hostilities breaking out between Japan and the United States.
Yeah, I can address part of that. Yeah, by the way, David Newert's book is fantastic. It's Strawberry Days deals with what is now current day Bellevue and the racism that took place there. There's not only the Asian Exclusion Act, but there was a Chinese Exclusion Act of the 1880s, the Alien Land Laws, which forbid Japanese Americans from owning property. You could not own property unless you were a citizen, and if you didn't naturalize before that date, you couldn't be a landowner. On Bainbridge Island, they had a lot of 5-year-old landlords because they used their children's name as a landlord because they are under the 14th Amendment U.S. citizens. But David Newert's book outlines remarkable white supremacy that was taking place there. A man by the name of Miller Freeman started his own newspaper just so he could have an anti-Japanese screed. And he published and promoted the phrase yellow peril. And it's been debated whether he actually created that phrase or not. But he did manage to stir up all of the animosity against the Japanese Americans and their strawberry farms, and where Bellevue Squares, of which his progeny, his sons or maybe grandsons own, and all that downtown area used to be strawberry fields. And they got them at fire sale prices, either cheaply or if they might have been in arrears at the tax assessor, they could sometimes get them for just some back taxes. And so they lost their farms. There were some people, and I'd like to stress, by the way, there were a lot of people up and down the West Coast who were like the Woodwards and like all the people on most people on Bainbridge who looked after their Japanese American friends and neighbors' properties and paid their taxes and such. But in all those communities, they were certainly an exception. You know, they were outliers. They weren't in the mainstream, and that was true in Bellevue. There are stories of some people coming back to camps from concentration camp to Bellevue to their own farm, but they were blocked off. They were terrorized by people blocking their own driveway, you know, with forks and weapons and things like that. So it was a totally different atmosphere in Bellevue. And David Newert's book is really, really good scholarship and really worth a read.
Since that maybe Freeman profited from these?
Oh gosh, yeah. I mean, you got these properties. I mean, the farms were selling for cheap everywhere. The Japanese American farmers would sell it for whatever they would get. Some of these people bought, you know, very expensive radios that were only maybe a year old and, you know, pennies on the dollar. And, you know, and their properties and all the rest. And that was certainly the case in Bellevue. There were fire sales in Bellevue. People really took advantage of all of the distress that all those folks had to do to just, you know, get rid of their properties. They couldn't take it with them.
I had heard a story of a woman, or maybe many women, that tried to sell their china, and the prices that they were offered were so low they said no, and instead smashed their china.
Yeah, and if I can just add to that, this happened on Bainbridge Island, but this also happened everywhere because people were so suspicious of Japanese and you know, perhaps Buddhist, but anything Japanese, their letters, kimonos, dolls, many of the parents had destroyed them all. I mean, some of these were priceless heirlooms, you know, centuries old from, you know, old relatives from Japan, samurai swords and the rest. And Kei Sakai Nakao talks about throwing them into the outhouse or burying them or burning them, you know, dolls that her grandmother had sent her. Because of those FBI raids on February 4th, they said, we can't have anything that looks Japanese because they suspect us all of being spies or that we're not loyal. And so that was a very familiar story for a lot of Japanese American families up and down the coast of destroying everything that looked Japanese to what looked Japanese to the mainstream white community.
And just to do another shout out, some of those stories are actually in American Sutra. There's some of the better stories in there. This is a book that's full of stories, wonderful stories, tragic stories in many cases. But I really think it's a great book, even though I'm biased. It had something to do with it. And hope you'll all look it up. American Sutra, A Story of Faith and Freedom in the Second World War. I have one comment here. I don't know if you can see it, Duncan, from Art Nomura. Can you see that? He says about the churches, he says a Japanese American friend, Buddhist friend, went to Japan and asked about when the Buddhist Sunday school was available in Japan, and the priest didn't know what he was talking about.
Right. So that's certainly true that, you know, there's a major difference between how things had to get adapted, but that's no different than in the 2,500-year history of Buddhism, when Buddhism moved from India to China, or China to Japan, or Japan to the United States. Each time it always goes through some kind of adaptation. And amongst the things people did in camp was to adapt to their environment. And as Clarence was talking about, people had so little time to you know, settle their affairs, sell their property, you know, different things. And so they often didn't take Buddhist implements to camp. And so among the different stories I tell in the book, I talk about people crafting things for their faith life in camp, using desert wood or spare wood from the mess hall, from, you know, packaging crates and so on, and making butsudan, or like Buddhist altars, sometimes using fruit pits to make ojuzu, or prayer beads. These are the type of things that people are very, how should you say, creative and ingenious, and found a way to be resilient despite all of these very difficult times.
I wonder if you saw any evidence of that, Brian?
I'm sorry, what was that again, Kerry?
Duncan was talking about how the Buddhists adapt, you know, carve things and adapt things because they couldn't take their own religious objects and symbols from home. They crafted new ones in the camps, and I wondered if there was any of your photographs that spoke to that at all.
You know, none of my photographs, anything I think that was left there, at least I haven't found anything like that. I've found, you know, nails and other pieces of metal, stovepipe, things of that nature. I've never seen any religious articles or remains of furniture or anything like that. There are a lot of things in a variety of museums. The Interpretive Center at Manzanar has a lot of things. Actually, a little museum just north of Manzanar in Independence, the Eastern California Museum, I believe it's called, has quite a large Manzanar collection.
Yeah.
And but yes, Duncan's right. There were, you know, they used pretty much anything that they had available to make things. You know, they made furniture out of vegetable crates and things of that nature.
I have a question here from Catherine Burrell that I'm having a hard time parsing exactly, but I think she's asking whether or not this education about Manzanar and the Japanese American internment and so on is finding itself in government and educational materials, whether they think that's happening.
Yeah, that certainly is. California did that in a big way. I believe it was a Civil Liberties Act of '88, but in California, they have a Civil Liberties Act that requires this to be taught in schools. And I believe, I can't remember which grades, but it is part of required curriculum in California. It's also here in Washington State, and we have a Civil Liberties Act that has that be part of, Washington State history. So it's being told that way. And of course, the scholarly books, the books the two authors here today, and there's volumes. There's a couple right over my shoulder that tell the story in so many different ways. The story of In the Camp, or the war heroes, or you name it. So this is a very well documented story. So schools are telling it, but my personal story, I didn't learn about it till I got to college. My father never talked about it, nor was it taught when I was going through high school. So we've come a long ways on that regard.
What was that? What was your personal story that you learned?
Oh, how I discovered it? Or is that what you're asking?
Yeah, or what it was.
Well, I went to the University of Washington, and one of the reasons I was eager to get the heck out of Moses Lake. The best view of that town is I-90 westbound and 100 miles in the rearview mirror. But all the Japanese American kids met on the third floor of the undergraduate library, UGL, and they were from Seattle schools, Roosevelt or Rainier Beach, and I was from Moses Lake, and they didn't know where that was. And then Kevin Kura from Bainbridge Island said, well, Clarence, where did your parents go to camp? And I said, well, I'm a farmer's kid. We didn't have time for summer camp. And two of the guys in unison said, concentration camp, you moron. And I had no idea what they're talking about. And so at Thanksgiving break, I asked my father about it. And my father's a very talkative guy, kind of life of the party person. And for once, he was kind of quiet. And he said this Japanese word called gaman, and gaman means to bear the unbearable, to persevere, to move forward. There's also another phrase, shigatake ganai, means it can't be helped. And those are phrases that any Japanese American person knows because our parents say those all the time. And he said, the job of your mother and me is to give you and your brother and sister a happy life. What we had to endure is none of your problem. And when I say this to my Jewish and Catholic friends, they all wish they grew up Japanese. But that's how I first learned about it. And that's when I got involved. And I went to study Japanese American history and then to other Asian American classes. And the more I learned, the more stunned I was that this could actually happen. And so that was also when the redress movement started, all of us third generation angry young men, and led to the official apologies and a redress or restitution to the survivors.
I know that Manzanar is a National Historic Site. I believe just a few years ago, Tule Lake was designated as a Park Service Historic Site. Are other of the camps designated that way now?
Minidoka is, and it's getting more and more robust. Actually, we are a satellite unit of the Minidoka National Historic Site, where, of course, I mentioned the Bainbridge Islanders ended up in their final years living there. And Heart Mountain has got national recognition as well. So there are several. Manzanar, by far and away, was designated many decades ago, and it is the very robust, big, because they happened to have a building. It was, I think it was an auditorium, and then later was after the war was some kind of vehicle maintenance facility, and it is now the interpretive center at the site. It's very large. It's a very impressive museum.
Yeah, I would just second that. And if anybody hasn't been to the site and hasn't been to the interpretive center, it really is as Clarence was saying, probably the most developed in some ways. Heart Mountain is also very good, and Minidoka. And increasingly, some of the other camps have kind of satellite, like Rower and Jerome. When I went 20 years ago, it was just basically cotton fields and then that cemetery, and that was it. And today there's a museum in McGee. And so each place slowly, I think all of these sites are getting enough attention to have some kind of interpretive center, some kind of educational context for those who would like to visit.
If I can segue on Duncan, if you have been to the Japanese American Memorial on Bainbridge, it's a beautiful sinuous wall that's 276 feet long, 1 foot for every Japanese American who lived on the island at the start of the war. And we have an interpretive pavilion. And we have an exclusion departure deck that is under construction as I speak, which is kind of representing the first 50 feet of the dock. It just extends over the water. And then it's like you're leaving the island. But we do have our final phase, and we want to work toward that. And we do want to have an interpretive center someday. So please keep us in your minds when we move forward on that capital campaign.
In your minds and in your pocketbooks. Exactly. Any final thoughts from any of you? Well, I want to definitely encourage everyone to go down to Northwind Arts Center on Water Street in downtown Port Townsend, beautiful downtown Port Townsend. I think the gallery is now open 3 days a week, is it, Brian? It's 4 days, so it's Thursday through Sunday from 1 in the afternoon.
12 to 5.
1 to 5.
12 to 5.
I know it's a narrow window, and we're living in these hard COVID times, but I hope you get down there. It's quite an extraordinary, both an extraordinary exhibit on its own and an extraordinary occasion for this important remembrance. Thank you, everyone, for attending, and thanks especially to our distinguished guest. I think this was extraordinarily informative and wonderful discussion. I know I enjoyed it. So thank you all.
Thank you. And Kerry, I just have one little thing. People are asking about this recording being posted. It will be posted on the Northwind site, or a link to it, to the YouTube channel, within a couple of days. So we'll just check the Northwind site.
So thank you, Clarence. Wonderful to meet you. Hope to see you again. And nice to see you, Duncan. So till next time.
Thank you, gentlemen.
Thank you. Congratulations.
Thank you.
Thank you.